By day, the Star Ferry Terminal is all glare and bustle. Tourists clutching paper cups, office workers sprinting for the green and white boat that stitches Hong Kong together in 8 quiet minutes. But after the last announcement fades and the turnstiles fall silent, the harbor becomes a black sheet, and the wind carries sounds that don't belong to the present. Just before 3, the deckhands swear the tide changes. The pilings groan like someone exhaling underwater. And on certain nights, when the clock on the concourse ticks one breath past the end of service, a woman steps from the shadows in a white coat too thin for the hour. She walks with the certainty of habit, heels clicking along a path polished by decades of commuters, and stops where Gate 3 used to be, where no gate exists now. She doesn't glance at the timetable. She doesn't fumble for coins. She looks past the rail into the dark and waits for a ferry that was retired years ago. A vessel no longer listed on any register, a hull that, if you ask the old skippers, sank in weather too sudden to outrun. When the water finally hums and the low horn answers from nowhere, the woman boards without turning her head, and the night closes over the wake as if it had never been disturbed at all. Her name was Clara Wong, a 23-year-old journalism student who carried a notebook like an extra limb. She was not a believer in ghosts. At least that was what she told her classmates whenever. Urban legends surfaced during late-night study sessions. What she did believe in were stories, the kind that hid behind headlines or crouched in the margins of archives. When her professor challenged the class to uncover a local mystery worth retelling, Clara chose the Star Ferry. By day, she had ridden it countless times, the deck vibrating under the churn of engines, the skyline unraveling on both sides like a painted scroll. The terminal smelled of diesel, roasted chestnuts from a nearby stall, the salt of Victoria Harbour. Families jostled for seats, lovers leaned against the rails, and office workers scrolled through phones, indifferent to the scenery that tourists try to capture. Clara saw nothing mystical there, only the ordinary pulse of the city. But night transformed the place. After the final departure, when the gates closed and the fluorescent lights dimmed, the concourse looked like a stage abandoned mid-performance. Pigeons cooed in the rafters. Footsteps echoed too loudly, and the sea slapped against pilings with a hollow rhythm. Security guards walked in pairs, rarely speaking, their radios whispering static into the stillness. Clara had heard the rumors. An apparition of a woman in white boarding a ferry that no longer existed. A phantom horn sounding from beyond the harbor mouth. Fishermen claimed to see the wake of a vessel cutting across the black water, though no ferry was scheduled. It was the kind of tale dismissed as folklore, but to Clara, it was an invitation. Armed with her camera and a notebook filled with questions, she decided to spend a week shadowing the terminal after dark. She wanted atmosphere, details, textures of silence. She expected boredom, maybe a scare or two from stray cats. What she did not expect was that the terminal itself seemed to be waiting for her, like a theater that needed an audience before the curtain could rise. Clara's first night at the terminal passed quietly, too quietly. She sat near the closed ticket counter, her notebook balanced on her knee, the hum of the city dwindling as traffic above the pier thinned. The janitor pushed a mop along the floor, nodding at her presence without comment, and the guards exchanged uneasy glances when she explained she was working on a university project. After the last ferry had groaned away, leaving a long ribbon of white water trailing behind, the place seemed to exhale. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the clock ticked past midnight, and nothing more happened. She left yawning, almost disappointed. The second night, she chose to stand by the old Gate 3, where rumors placed the apparition. The gate no longer existed, dismantled in a renovation years earlier, but the faint outline of bolts and scraped concrete still marked where the turnstile once stood. She leaned against the rail, notebook closed, the harbor breathing below. At exactly 12:30, she heard the faint blare of a horn. Not the sharp mechanical bark of modern ferries, but a deeper, older tone that vibrated through her ribs. She jerked her head toward the water, black, empty, only the moonlight trembling on its surface. No vessel, no wak. The horn faded into silence. On the third night, her camera captured something her eyes could not. Reviewing the footage on her laptop, she froze the frame. There, beyond the terminal's edge, faint and grainy, a line of light shimmered across the harbor as if a prow cut water. No ferry was scheduled, and the marine logs the next morning confirmed no craft had passed through. The image might have been a glitch, but when she zoomed in, a smudge in white stood at the edge of the pier, facing outward. She laughed it off when she showed her classmate the next day. "It's probably just lens flare," she said, though her hand shook when she turned the page of her notebook. On the fourth night, she brought a thermos of coffee and a determination to stay until dawn. Around 2 in the morning, when the guards had retreated to their station and the terminal seemed deserted, Clara heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heels tapping against tile. She stiffened, certain another commuter had slipped in. But when she turned, the concourse was empty. The sound continued, passing just behind her, circling toward where Gate 3 once stood. Her throat tightened. Then she smelled something faint but unmistakable, sea salt mixed with old perfume. A floral scent out of step with the sterile night air. She whispered, half out of fear, half out of habit as a reporter, "Who's there?" The answer was silence, but when she looked back down at the harbor, ripples spread outward from the pier as though a vessel had just departed. Clara closed her notebook with shaking hands. The legend was no longer a rumor. It was a pattern, and she had stepped into its rhythm without meaning to. By the fifth night, Clara's skepticism had frayed. She returned with her camera slung across her chest and a small recorder tucked in her pocket. The guards barely acknowledged her now. Perhaps they thought she was foolish, or perhaps they didn't want to be implicated in what she might discover. The air was heavy with humidity, the harbor thick with mist. When the final ferry docked and departed, its engines grumbling into the dark, Clara felt the stillness settle like a curtain. Midnight passed. She sat on the steps near the concourse, sipping lukewarm coffee, when the horn came again. This time it was closer, deeper, resonant enough that the glass of the waiting area vibrated. She sprang to her feet, recorder on, camera ready. The water remained empty, but the pier trembled as though something massive had moored against it. Her lens caught shadows sliding along the planks, elongated forms without bodies. She steadied her breath, muttering, "It's the mist. It has to be the mist." But then the mist parted, and she saw footprints, wet and sharp, trailing across the floor. Not the scuff of sneakers or sandals, but the pointed marks of heeled shoes, walking steadily toward Gate 3. Clara followed, heart hammering, the click of her pen echoing absurdly loud in the silence. The trail ended where the old gate once stood. She crouched, running her fingers along the damp impressions, but when she looked up, she was no longer alone. At the far end of the pier, a figure had appeared. A woman, tall and slender, wearing a white coat. That swayed though there was no wind. Her face was blurred in shadow, but the outline of her hair glistened as if wet. She stood perfectly still, gazing out across the harbor. Clara raised her camera, but before she could press the shutter, the woman turned. Not fully, only enough that Clara sensed eyes meeting hers across the distance. Cold ran through her veins, a recognition without. Introduction. Then the sound began, a low, mournful creak of wood and the slap of water against a hull. The phantom ferry was arriving. The pier shifted underfoot. Clara clutched the rail as the invisible vessel groaned into dock. The woman in white took a step forward, heels clicking with unnatural clarity. She walked past Clara, unhurried, unwavering, as though Clara didn't exist. The scent of salt and faded perfume washed over her. When the woman reached the edge of the pier, she lifted her hand as though grasping an unseen rail and stepped into emptiness. But instead of falling, she vanished into the mist, her form dissolving like smoke. The horn blared once more, shaking the concourse windows. Then all was still. Clara gasped for breath, realizing her recorder was still running. When she replayed it moments later, her skin crawled. The audio captured not only the horn and the footsteps, but also a faint voice layered beneath. In Cantonese, fragile yet distinct, a woman whispered, "He never came back." That night, Clara could not sleep. She scoured archives for shipwrecks, searching for ferries that had sunk, captains who had vanished. What she uncovered suggested a story darker than she had expected. A storm in the 1970s, a ferry that capsized mid-crossing, and a passenger list that included a young woman who never reached home. The Star Ferry Terminal was no longer just an assignment. It had become a wound that refused to close, and Clara knew she had been chosen, willing or not, to witness it. Clara spent the next day buried in the library. The faint buzz of fluorescent lamps above her head, stacks of brittle newspapers spread across the table. She searched with feverish determination, chasing every headline about ferry accidents, drownings, unexplained disappearances. Finally, she found it. A small article from September 1974, half buried on page 6 of the South China Morning Post. The headline read, "Ferry capsizes in sudden storm. Dozens missing." The report was brief, almost clinical. A late-night ferry bound for Tsimsha Tsui had been caught in violent winds. The captain and crew went down with the vessel. Official records listed 32 passengers missing, presumed drowned. But Clara's eyes snagged on a single name repeated across eyewitness accounts. Liang Meihua, 27. Witnesses described her waiting near the pier in Central, clutching a white coat too light for the weather. A fiancé was supposed to meet her on the other side. He never did. When the storm broke, Meihua had boarded anyway. She was last seen standing near the railing as the waves pitched higher, her hand raised as if waving to someone on shore. Her body was never recovered. Clara leaned back, the article trembling between her fingers. She heard again the whisper from her recorder. He never came back. The words weren't about her fiancé failing to meet her. They were about the ferry itself, never returning, forever trapped between departure and arrival. Later that night, Clara returned to the pier, clutching the photocopied article in her pocket. Like a talisman, the guards gave her wary looks but didn't intervene. Perhaps they had seen her persistence, or perhaps they, too, knew better than to interfere. Standing at the outline of Gate 3, Clara unfolded the paper. She read the name aloud, her voice shaking. Liang Meihua. The harbor answered with a sigh, the tide lapping louder against the pilings. She read the headline, the date, the details of the storm. Her words felt like keys turning in a long rusted lock. The mist thickened around her, wrapping the pier in a shroud. And then she smelled it again, that faint perfume, salt-laced, impossibly out of place. The woman appeared, clearer this time, her face still shadowed, but her posture unmistakably human. She turned her head, eyes hollow with grief, and mouthed something Clara could not hear. Clara stepped forward, holding out the article. "I know what happened," she whispered. "I found your story. You weren't forgotten." For the first time, the woman's form wavered, not like smoke dispersing, but like a candle flame flickering against a sudden wind. Her expression softened, grief bending into something else, recognition, relief. Yet even as Clara's heart surged with triumph, the air shifted. A deep vibration rolled beneath her feet, the echo of a horn far out at sea. The Phantom Ferry was returning, and this time, it was not just for the woman in white. The pier groaned under invisible weight, the boards shuddering as if a massive vessel pressed against them. Clara gripped the railing, her knuckles pale as the horn bellowed again, louder this time, shaking her ribcage, rattling the glass of the waiting hull behind her. The mist swirled, condensing into the outline of a hull, its green and white paint ghostly, its decks crowded with shadowy passengers. Their faces were indistinct, but their posture radiated despair. Slumped shoulders, heads bowed, arms locked around absent loved ones. And at the center, waiting at gate 3, the woman in white. "Mayua." She turned to Clara with eyes that gleamed faintly, no longer blurred shadows, but deep pools of grief. She lifted her hand toward the Phantom Ferry, as if begging permission to board. Clara's instinct screamed at her to run, to flee the pier and never look back. But her journalist's stubbornness, that relentless drive to witness, anchored her in place. "I found you," she said, voice quaking. "I know your name, your story. You don't have to keep waiting." The woman's lips moved, but the voice that answered did not come from her mouth. It came from the harbor itself, echoing across the water. He never came back. He never came back. The passengers on the Phantom Ferry shifted, turning their faceless heads toward Clara in unison. A chorus of whispers rose, layered, suffocating. "Find us. Remember us. We never came back." The air turned icy, searing her lungs. Her recorder, still running, crackled violently, filling with voices that overlapped in languages she couldn't parse. She staggered, covering her ears, but the sound pressed into her skull like hands pushing from all directions. Then the deck shifted violently, as though the ferry itself demanded she step aboard. The mist surged, forming a gangway of shadowy planks between pier and ship. Mayhua stepped onto it gracefully, her form solidifying with each pace. The passengers parted to let her through, their silence more terrifying than their whispers. Clara gasped, reaching out. "Wait!" She thrust the article forward, the one she had photocopied from the archives. "I know what happened. The world knows. You don't need to keep boarding." Mayhua paused at the gangway's midpoint. For a moment, Clara thought she might turn back, but then a storm wind erupted from nowhere, tearing the paper from Clara's hand, whipping it into the mist where it vanished. The horn blared once more, long and mournful, and the woman's gaze fixed on Clara with unbearable intensity. "You cannot stop what never ended," the harbor seemed to whisper. Clara's vision blurred as the mist thickened. She was drowning on dry land, dragged into a memory not her own. She saw flashes, rain lashing against decks, passengers screaming as waves towered, the captain shouting orders swallowed by wind. She felt cold water, flooding lungs that weren't hers, tasted salt and blood. And then silence, suffocating and eternal. When her vision cleared, she stood no longer on the pier, but on the Phantom Ferry's deck. Around her, the passengers swayed with the rhythm of a storm unseen, their faceless heads bowed. Mayhua stood at the bow, hair whipping in phantom wind, her eyes locked on Clara. "This is where we are," she whispered. This time the words were clear, raw, pulled from some well of sorrow that had not dried in decades. "This is where we remain." Clara's pulse thundered. She could not breathe. Her chest constricted with terror and empathy. "Then tell me," she begged. "Tell me what I can do. Tell me how to free you." But the answer was only the ferry's horn, a howl that shook the world. Apart, the deck buckled, the mist surged, and the shadow passengers rushed toward her in a wave of cold bodies. Clara stumbled back, the gangway collapsing beneath her feet. She fell, screaming, into black water that burned like ice. And then silence. She found herself sprawled on the pier, gasping for air, her recorder lying beside her, still blinking red. The mist had cleared. The harbor lay empty. The phantom ferry was gone. Only the faintest scent of perfume lingered, and the sound of dripping water from her hair, though she had never left the pier. Clara left the terminal just before dawn. Her recorder clutched like a lifeline. When she played it back on the tram ride home, her stomach knotted. The horn was there, impossibly clear, and beneath it the layered voices of dozens whispering fragments. Names, prayers, the word return in Cantonese, English, even Japanese. And woven through it all, one steady refrain. He never came back. She tried to share the story with her professor, but the man grew pale, shaking his head. "Don't publish it," he urged. "Some histories are left to the sea." Her classmates laughed nervously, assuming she had let her imagination wander. Only Clara knew what the recorder contained. Only she had felt the deck buckle, smelled the perfume, met the gaze of the woman who had been waiting for her. Half a century. In the weeks that followed, Clara returned to the pier only once, standing by the outline of Gate 3 as the city swarmed in daylight. Tourists snapped photographs of the skyline, oblivious to the silence that clung to the concrete. She thought she heard, just for a heartbeat, the low sigh of a horn carried on the wind. That night she dreamt of the ferry again. In the dream, Mei Hua stood on the deck, no longer blurred, her face serene. She raised her hand, not in farewell, but in recognition. Clara woke with tears on her cheeks and the certainty that the woman had finally been seen. But the harbor keeps its secrets. The guards still avoid the far end of the pier after midnight. Fishermen still whisper of wakes that vanish without boats. And sometimes, on storm-heavy nights, the sound of a horn rolls across Victoria Harbour long after the last ferry is docked. The legend of the Star Ferry ghost is more than a tale to chill night guards or amuse tourists. It is a reminder that not all journeys find their end, and not all passengers make it home. The harbor that glitters with skyscraper light by day becomes, by night, a mirror for what the city has chosen to forget. Mei Hua's story is not unique. She stands for every name blurred in. Newspapers, every face lost in a storm, every life written off as collateral to weather and time. The phantom ferry that still glides across the water is not merely a ghost ship. It is a ledger, a vessel carrying all those whom memory failed. Perhaps that is why it returns, not to terrify, but to insist on recognition. A city builds towers and erases piers, but the sea never forgets. It keeps its passengers, and sometimes it allows them to step ashore, if only for a moment, if only to be seen. So when you walk the harbor at night and hear a horn echo across empty water, do not laugh too quickly. Do not dismiss it as machinery or wind. Remember instead that somewhere, someone once waited on the pier with hope in their eyes and a ticket in their hand, and that their story is still unfolding with each tide.